let's talk about gluten. That's the rage these days. And there is no question that some people should not have gluten. Celiac patients, for example, need to eat a medically gluten-free diet, which means that even a tiny amount of gluten can be harmful because it can flatten out the villi in the intestine. So these are people who walk around the grocery store looking at ingredients on condiments and that sort of thing to make sure that they should eat no gluten. Then you have another class of people who have conditions that are not quite as serious as celiac in terms of their reaction to gluten. Patients with inflammatory bowel disease, for example, would be best to stay away from high gluten foods. Some people do have what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And we have good studies now that show that when you do a blind oral challenge, you take people who say, I'm sensitive to gluten, you give them gluten or placebo and cross them over, and there's definitely reaction. So we have that. But if you were to add up all the people who are in those categories, celiac, sensitive to gluten, have a condition where gluten is contraindicated, you're talking about a pretty small percentage of the population. What has happened is that a couple of not very good researchers who, if the books that they wrote were turned into me from undergraduate students as papers, they get a failing grade for failure to document their point. But they've become New York Times best-selling books that talk about the evils of grains and the evils of gluten and wheat. And it's one more thing where people who aren't very good at doing research write popular books claiming that one magical change in your diet will fix everything. Just stay away from grains or stay away from gluten. And I'll tell you what these people have done that has been really helpful to me, though, is in their ignorance, they have made popular this idea that everybody should avoid gluten. And so there has been this proliferation in the marketplace of really good gluten-free food, pastas, breads, crackers. And so for the people who really, really do need to avoid gluten, the options are much better. The unfortunate part of all of this is that a lot of people have been convinced that their problem is gluten when it's not, or their problem is grains when it's not. So it's become a distraction so that people aren't dealing with the real causes of their health issues. And it also adds a layer of difficulty to dietary change that is not warranted. And one thing we know is that the harder you make this, the less compliance you get. So many people, when they visit our office and they see all of the evidence, because what our job is to do is to put evidence in front of people and let them make up their own mind about what they think about all this stuff. Once they see all the evidence, they're pretty excited that pasta and bread is not toxic. They can go back to eating it. And then, like I said, for the people that really do have to address this issue, the choices are much better for them than they used to be. So one question people ask me sometimes is, how do I know if a food's bad for me? Well, sometimes you know because there's an immediate reaction. A child who goes into anaphylactic shock when he eats peanuts, there's not much question about that. Right? And some adults have the same response to peanuts or other foods. That's a pretty small percentage, thankfully, also. Sometimes the reaction to other foods can be not quite so severe, but the same. People eat dairy and they become constipated, or they eat gluten and they develop diarrhea or gas or pain or something of that nature. And that's really wonderful because you can tie the food to the symptom. But I'll tell you what is the bigger problem, is that for the vast majority of people and the vast majority of foods that are harmful, the effect is not immediate. I've always said that if I were queen of the universe for just a day, I think the human body is really well designed, but I would make one very significant change, just one. Here's what it would be. There are no nerve endings inside the blood vessels of the body. And so people can eat fat and cholesterol and deposit fat and cholesterol and plaques in the arteries, and they don't experience any discomfort, even though they have miles of arteries in the body lined with these plaques, one of which can rupture and cause your heart attack. So just think about it for a minute. I'm queen of the universe. I put nerve endings in the blood vessels. So you eat a meal of fried chicken and French fries, and instead of not feeling anything until later when you have your heart attack after doing it for years, all of those nerve endings in the blood vessels start to trigger, and you have this ungodly pain that is so severe because it's systemic. It's from your head to your foot. You end up on the kitchen floor in the fetal position, and after you recover from that, I don't see you eating a lot of fried chicken and French fries, but that's not the way it works. I don't get to be queen of the universe, and I can't cause the immediate reaction. So what happens is people eat a terrible diet, and other than some weight gain and maybe fatigue, and they develop some symptoms like high blood pressure and cholesterol. And I mentioned earlier, the problem with that is everybody's got it, so it doesn't seem like it's so severe. They don't really understand the consequences of the terrible choices they're making until they result in something fairly cataclysmic, like a heart attack or some type of cancer or serious disease that can be life-threatening. So the big issue we have is that you can eat terribly for a long time before something really bad happens. And unfortunately, they haven't been taught to see that. My analogy that helps people understand is, what if I just decided that I'm gonna run stop signs as long as I can get away with it? I mean, I could run a lot of stop signs and not get hit by a car. It gives me a false sense of security that it's really okay to drive carelessly. But even if I was able to get away with it for 10 years, sooner or later, I'm going to run a stop sign and get hit by a bus. And that's what's happening to people. They're doing the equivalent of driving and running stop signs with their diet, and then sooner or later, something really awful happens. And then they all wake up, and people become willing to do almost anything at that point in time. And we need to get people to want to do almost anything to stay healthy instead of getting to that point.